My name is Mitt Regan. I'm a senior fellow here at the Stockdale Center. I'm also a professor at Georgetown Law Center. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor David Rodin of Oxford University. David is one of the world's foremost philosophers on issues of war, conflict, use of force, and just war theory. He's co-director of the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, also part-time faculty member at the European University Institute in Florence. In addition, David has worked with several Western militaries on issues of ethics and organizational culture. So we're very pleased to have David with me. Please join me in welcoming David Rodin.
Great, thank you very much. Well, welcome to the graveyard shift. We've had lunch, our bodies have been nourished, our minds have been nourished by those wonderful remarks from David and the earlier speakers, and now we're all feeling a bit sleepy, and we're feeling like we could do with a bit of a nap, I'm sure. So the bad news is that instead of a nap, you have me for the next hour. And the even worse news is that we're going to be doing some analytical moral philosophy together. Now, I'm fully aware that not everybody in the audience is an analytical moral philosophy, and moreover that some of you may indeed have an allergy or an allergic reaction to that discipline. So if that does apply to you, then I do give you my one-off permission to phase out a little bit, fiddle with your phones, check your email. Not to check Facebook, because Facebook is evil. But nonetheless, I'll do my best to take you along with me in this argument, and hopefully to provide you with some thoughts, some ideas that might be useful, relevant to the many important issues that I know that all of you here in the room are thinking about. So what I wanted to do today was to reflect a little bit on a conundrum or a puzzle about the relationship between the authority condition within just war theory and interstate, and in particular revolutionary war, and to try and reflect on what that conundrum tells us about the nature both of that authority condition and also of how we should think about the permissibility or otherwise of revolutionary war. So the tension between those two ideas is not very hard to articulate. So as we all know, under classical just war theory, there is a jus ad bellum condition of authority. So along with the other conditions for a war or a military action to be justifiable, along with it having a just cause, with it being proportionate, with it being last resort, with it being conducted under right intention, it ought to be conducted by and under an appropriate or proper authority. And under classical interpretation of just war theory, that was generally taken to mean under the authority of the sovereign actor within the state. So now we immediately have a collision between that condition and the idea of a justifiable revolutionary war, because by definition, a revolutionary war is not conducted by the sovereign. Indeed, it is conducted against the sovereign. So on a very strict classical interpretation of just war theory, one thing that you might conclude is that no revolutionary war can ever be justified jus ad bellum. Case closed. Now, of course, the other way of looking at that collision is to say, well, that's a little bit odd. You know, there might be lots and lots of reasons for objecting morally to revolutionary wars, and we've heard some very eloquent discussions of those this morning. But it's very odd to think that you can tell or determine that a revolutionary war is unjustified, as it were, analytically, just reading it directly off the conditions of just war theory. There must be something wrong with our interpretation of the just war theory if that's the implication. There must be another way to understand that or to interpret that. And if you were the kind of moral philosopher who was minded to think about just war ethics according to the approach that's sometimes called revisionist just war theory, and I know that there are a couple of people in the room who do write and think in that, in those lines, you might think that there's actually a much broader reason to be skeptical about the authority condition more generally. So what revisionists think about just war theory is that the ethics of war really just is the ethics of individual violence, individual use of force, as it were, scaled up to a very large scale. And in essence, a war or a conflict of any kind is simply a lot of acts of individual self-defense or aggression, iterated in a very, very complex array. And one of the things that we might think about individual self-defense is it doesn't have an authority condition, right? If you're attacked by somebody in a dark street, there's no kind of requirement that there be some special political authoritative actor under which that action is taken. You're just permitted to go ahead and do it. We might think of it as a kind of self-authorizing action. And if war just is the aggregation of lots and lots of acts of individual self-defense, you might think, well, we just need to throw that authority condition away. It's just not relevant at all. So then the problem with revolutionary war kind of goes away. Now, what I want to try and suggest is that's the wrong way to think about it. That there is, in fact, a viable and important way to understand that notion of an authority requirement within jus ad bellum. But it's going to turn out to be a very, very different requirement than the way that we interpret it or have understood it in classical just war theory. So let's start maybe by just stepping back and reflecting a little bit by what we mean or what we can mean by that notion of authority. So authority can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. So one kind of family or clusters of things that we mean by authority is that it's simply the possession or exercise of a certain kind of power, right? You have authority if you have power to act in a certain context or on a certain set of other individuals. A second related conception is the possession and exercise of power that is in a certain sense morally legitimated. And in the classical interpretation of just war theory, when you think about the authority condition as applying to, as it were, acts of war undertaken by the sovereign, it's generally drawing on those two senses of what it means to be an authority. It's either the entity that has and exercises power, and more specifically, that does so in a way that is legitimate. But there's another way of thinking about what authority is and what it means that doesn't have to do with possessing and exercising power, but has to do with the ability to make certain kinds of judgments or determinations. Now, in this sense, when we describe an individual or an institution as an authority, what we mean is that they have the capabilities to make certain kinds of judgments or determinations that we regard as authoritative. And what we mean by authoritative is that those judgments reliably track or respond to underlying normative reasons. So we can think about that concept of authority as applying in any domain where there are underlying normative or other forms of reason. So for example, in epistemology, we might say that somebody is an authority epistemically in a given domain if they are able to make authoritative judgments, that is they're able to reliably make judgments that track the underlying reasons around what is the correct thing to believe. In the normative domain, we might think about a legal authority as an entity, an individual, or an institution that is able to reliably produce judgments that track underlying reasons within the law about what the correct legal outcome ought to be. And in the moral domain, we might say that a moral authority is an agent or an institution that is able to produce judgments that reliably track the underlying moral reasons. Right? So authority in that sense is about the making of judgments, determinations, and it's about this reliable relationship between the judgments made and those underlying reasons. And it's probably worth, I don't want to give a full-blown account of what it means to be an authority, but it's probably worth just really briefly sketching out the components of, I hope pretty familiar components of what it means to be an authority in those last two domains, in the domains of law or ethics, the normative domains. And it's pretty clear that in order to count as an authority in those domains, and David was speaking during lunch about law courts, criminal tribunals, or other legal tribunals, which are paradigm cases of legal authorities. So if you think about what's required to be an authority in these normative domains, it's pretty clear that there are at least these two elements. One element has to do with the competencies of that individual or institution. And there are really two competencies here that are critical. One is an epistemic competence, right? So it needs to have the capability to be able to determine, A, what the facts are, and B, what are the relevant legal or ethical principles. So it needs to have these epistemic competence to know those two sets of facts. And secondly, it needs to have a deliberative competence. It needs to be able to reason effectively and well from an understanding of the facts and the principles to some kind of conclusion. So there's something around the competence that agent has to have. The second component it has to have the right kinds of motivations, right? It has to be situated so that it is motivated so far as possible to respond to those underlying reasons and only those underlying reasons. So if you think, again, for example, about the case of a legal tribunal, one of the things that we say there is it has to have the conditions of impartiality and independence, right? It can't be the case that the judge is deciding on his own case or his own interests are at stake, because there his motivations would include motivations that are not directly related to the underlying reasons of justice, law, or morality, but they're in fact countervailing. So there are those two components, right? You have to have a set of capabilities, and to the greatest extent possible, you have to be situated so that your primary or your only motivations are the motivations to respond to those underlying reasons. So what I want to suggest, my hypothesis, is that when we think about that just war criterion of authority, and in particular when we think about it in the case of revolutions, we shouldn't think about it in that traditional just war way of meaning prosecuted by the sovereign. We should think about it as much more having to do with who has made the judgment or the determination to actually go to war and enter a state of war. Now, it's pretty obvious that those two interpretations are very, very different. And indeed, they'll often be conflicting, because what counts as an authority in the traditional sense, right, is the leader of the actor that has the skin in the game, right? The leader of the actor that's going to war. Whereas what I've been suggesting is that if we're thinking about authority and authoritative decisions in this way, one of the requirements may indeed be that you don't have skin in the game, that you are independent and impartial in that way. So it's going to give you a very, very different account of how authority plays out in real terms. So that's the hypothesis. So two questions arise here. One is, why should we even believe that there is such a requirement? All right? Why should we believe that there is ever a requirement to act under conditions of authority, in the sense of being determined by this unique kind of actor that has these capabilities? And when are those conditions fulfilled? When is it a requirement to act under some kind of situated authority in this way? Now, there are a lot of different kinds of answer that you could give to that, at least to that first question. You could give an answer from a consequentialist perspective, contractarian perspective. I want to develop with you a different kind of answer to that question, and one which I think helps to explain why this condition can really have teeth, and why it can also apply and have teeth even in those cases that the revisionist just war theorists are worried about, in cases like individual self-defense. And the answer that I'm going to want to end up giving is that there can sometimes be a requirement only to act under an authority in this sense, because that's a critical way of addressing a certain kind of wrongdoing, which I think has gone pretty substantially unnoticed in a lot of the literature. And I want to kind of back into this argument by looking at an account that Derek Parfit, a very famous account that Derek Parfit, the recently deceased British philosopher, gave about how we should think about wrongdoing in situations of uncertainty, where it's unclear exactly what the facts are. And Parfit has this very nice argument where he says, in situations of uncertainty, when we say that an action is wrong or that it's permissible, we can mean three very, very different things. So the first thing that we can mean is that the action is wrong relative to the facts as they actually existed. But we might mean something different. We might mean that the act is wrong or permissible, not relative to the facts as they actually existed, but relative to what the evidence tells us were those facts, which can be a very different thing. And then different again, he says, when we say something is wrong or permissible, we might say that it's wrong or permissible relative to what the actor believed the facts were. All right? So you have these three different demarcations: wrong relative to the facts, wrong relative to what the evidence tells us about the facts, and wrong relative to what we believe about it. That all sounds very complex, but it comes up pretty clearly when you think about an example. So Derek Parfit says, he gives these nice examples. He says, imagine I'm a bad doctor. I'm a really bad doctor because first of all, I'm really wicked, I'm evil, but I'm also just incompetent. And you're one of my patients, and I've always hated you. And so I give you a drug, thinking that this drug is going to kill you. But in fact, the drug is the one thing that you needed to cure your illness and save your life. So what do we say about that case, right? So Parfit says, well, actually, we have to say three things. We have to say, relative to the facts, I did the right thing, right? I gave you the drug that saved your life. That's clearly the right thing to do. Relative to the evidence, I did the right thing as well, right? Because any halfway competent doctor would have known that the drug would have saved your life. So relative to the evidence, I did the right thing. But relative to what I believed, I did the wrong thing, right? I thought the drug was going to kill you. I was attempting to murder you. So this is really useful because it helps you to kind of defuse a lot of arguments. So you get a complex case like that, and someone says, well, was it right or wrong what he did? And you say, well, on the one hand, it saved his life. That seems like the right thing. But on the other hand, he was trying to kill him. That seems like the wrong thing. And Parfit is able to just say, no, listen, there's no contradiction here. Relative to the facts, it was the right thing. Relative to the evidence, it was the right thing. Relative to the belief, it was the wrong thing. So it's a really neat distinction. Now, here's a question. Do those three ways or modes in which an action can be right, wrong, permissible that Parfit describes, relative to the facts, relative to beliefs, relative to evidence, do they exhaust the ways that an action can be right or wrong in context of uncertainty? Or to put the question another way, can we imagine a case where an action is permissible, it's the right thing to do in all of those three cases, but it's still, in some sense, the wrong thing to do? Now, I think we can. I think we can have cases like that, and I think what that points us to is a particular kind of wrongdoing to which the requirement of authority is precisely the solution. So let me start by giving you a couple of cases to kind of motivate what that sense of wrongdoing is, and then we'll circle back to see what's underlying that. Okay, so here's case number one. This is the case of arbitrary prescriber. So I'm a doctor. I'm again a terrible doctor. And you're my patient, and you come along and you're really sick, and I give you the pills in the blue bottle. And the pills in the blue bottle are just what you need to cure your disease. And any competent doctor would have known that they were the pills that would cure your disease, and I wanted to cure your disease, right? But I'm a weird kind of doctor in the sense that I have this kind of weird irrational belief that all pills and only pills that come in blue bottles cure that particular kind of disease. And if it had just so happened that the manufacturer had packaged the pills in the red bottle, I never would have given them to you. Right, that's a weird case, because here you have an action that's right in all of Parfit's senses, right? It's the right thing to do, fact relative, evidence relative, and belief relative, and yet it feels a bit problematic. Here's another case, which I call biased defender. Okay, so I'm walking downtown, and I come across two people, and it looks to me like the first person, person A, is unjustly attacking person B, and about to kill him. And I intervene in self-defense of B, and I kill A. Now, in fact, I'm right. A was just about to unjustly kill B. And moreover, the evidence supports that. A reasonable observer would have concluded exactly the same thing. And I wanted to defend the person against an unjust attack. But I have this awful unconscious racial bias. And a big part of the reason why I made this judgment that A was about to wrongfully kill B is that A was black and B was white. And if A had been white, I would not have reached that judgment. I would not have come to the conclusion that A was about to wrongfully kill B. And moreover, I would have come to the conclusion that A was about to kill B even if the evidence didn't support it. Now again, this is a case that meets all of the three Parfitian conditions, right? What I did was the right thing to do relative to the facts. A was about to kill B. Was the right thing to do relative to the evidence. A reasonable, impartial bystander would have come to the same conclusion. And it was the right thing to do relative to my beliefs. But again, it seems really problematic, right? What's that problematic element there that's being missed out? The problematic element has to do with the reliability of the mechanism by which I'm reaching that judgment underlying my action. I came to the right conclusion in each of these cases about what to do, but the reasoning process, the way that I got there, was so unreliable that it was a pure fluke, a pure accident that I came to the right conclusion rather than the wrong conclusion. And that seems to matter in terms of how we judge the morality of the action. Now, for anyone who's done any epistemology, you might notice that there is a similarity here between this argument that I've been making and a very famous argument made by Gettier about the theory of knowledge. So for a very, very long period of time, since Plato basically, people had believed that knowledge was having a justified true belief. And what Gettier noticed was that there were cases in which you could have a justified true belief, but it wasn't really knowledge because the process by which you arrived at that belief was not sufficiently reliable. So it's a simple example. So I look at the clock and I see that it says 2:15, and so I think to myself, oh, it's 2:15. So here we have a belief, it's true, it's justified. I looked at the clock, that's a way of justifying it. But unbeknown to me, the clock's broken, right? It's not moving at all. It just so happens that I looked at the clock at 2:15, precisely the moment when it was reading the right time. Now the problem there is, yes, my belief was true and it was justified, but it was accidentally justified. There was no reliable connection between my belief and the reasons for believing it. And that seems to be a parallel problem to the problem that we have in cases like arbitrary prescriber and biased offender. I'm reaching the right decision relative to facts, relative to evidence, relative beliefs, but the way that I'm getting there is so unreliable that we ought to say that there is a wrong-making feature, I think, in those acts. And what I call that wrong-making feature is determination relative wrongness. It's a pretty ugly name, but it's meant to reference the other ways of thinking about how an action can be wrong. So what we mean by that is that the act is not wrong relative to the interpretation of the facts or of the evidence or belief, but it's relative to the way by which, the means by which we made the determination, the judgment, the process by which we arrived at the determination of how to act. Now, if all of that is right, what that suggests is that in cases where we have reason to believe that we are not well situated to make judgments or determinations that reliably track underlying reasons about what we ought to do, that in some conditions there may be a requirement to defer those decisions, those judgments, to another entity, institution, or individual that is better able to make those judgments. And that, as we already saw, is what we describe as an authority. Now, under what conditions might we think that that's the case? Under what conditions might we think that it is the case that we have an obligation to defer to an entity or an agent that is authoritative in that way? Well, I think in really rough terms, we can say that we may have an obligation to defer in that way to an authority in cases where we have reason to suspect that we are not well situated to make those judgments reliably ourselves. And there are a lot of very, very common sense factors that may fall into this here. David spoke again about a number of them over lunch. It may be that we have reasons to suspect the reliability of our own judgment when our interests are very, very strongly engaged in the decision, right? We're going to get a huge payoff if we decide one way. Or we'll be at extreme risk if we decide in another way. Or if we decide in a particular way, it will require us to undergo a burdensome thing. So in those cases, we can be aware that we have very significant motivations to decide in a way that might not be reliably correlated with the norms of underlying norms of justice. Now, of course, that describes many of the everyday decisions that we make in the course of our everyday lives. And we don't think that we have to, as it were, defer to some kind of independent tribunal every time we interact with a colleague or buy a sandwich or do any of the other things that might have reasons applying to them. The reason for that is pretty obvious, which is that the consequences of those decisions for other people are generally pretty trivial. And so even though it may be the case that we're not making those decisions in the best, most reliable way, the costs of having to defer to an independent tribunal or more authoritative body would just massively outweigh the benefits. So there has to be some requirement that this authority condition, if it exists, will come into play where the consequences of our actions are potentially very, very serious for other people. Now, if that's right, then we might think that one of the paradigm cases where we should be subject to this authority requirement is a situation of self-defense. Because in a situation of self-defense, both of those conditions are at play. In a situation where I feel that I'm under threat and that the only way to avert that threat is to take harmful action or to kill another person, both of those two conditions are very strongly in play. So on the one hand, my most profound interests are at stake. My own life, bodily integrity is at stake, potentially. So I have very, very strong reasons for action that may not be aligned with the reasons of justice and morality. And secondly, the consequences for others are pretty damn significant. We're talking about the decision to kill or maim the aggressor. So you'd think that cases of self-defense would be paradigm cases where we would require a condition of authority. And yet, as I noticed at the outset, doesn't seem that way, right? It kind of seems like if you are subject to an unjust attack, you don't have to wait and defer to some kind of independent authoritative body. The action seems, as it were, self-authorizing. You're able to just go ahead and act in a way constrained, of course, by the norms of self-defense. Now, I want to suggest that that appearance is indeed very strong, but I think it's actually erroneous. I actually think that when we spell out the arguments in the way that I have, we can see that, in fact, we ought to view acts of self-defense as being subject to a requirement of authority, as it were, being determined by an authority in this way. It's just that the conditions under which that authority can play a role have to be very, very special. And the reason for that is because the conditions of self-defense are normally so immediate that there's simply no practical time to go and defer to an independent authoritative body to check whether lethal defensive action is in fact appropriate and justified. There's just no time. There's no possibility to do that. But if you think about a case where there is time, right? If you think about a more extended threat, let's say you believe that there's somebody in the community that is trying to poison you over a long period of time through a cumulative process of putting small amounts of poison into your food. There it seems much more plausible to assume that you shouldn't simply be permitted to take independent defensive action. You should be required to go and make your case to the authorities and to defer on their judgment about whether the conditions of defensive action are actually made. So there's something about the immediacy of most acts of self-defense that kind of pushes that requirement into the background. But what I want to note is that requirement to have the decision to act in self-defense overseen by some kind of independent authoritative body, it doesn't simply disappear, it doesn't vanish. It remains and it re-emerges as a form of post-facto review. So in any developed legal jurisdiction, an individual that engages in self-defense, particularly lethal self-defense, will be required to provide an account of their action before an authoritative body, normally a criminal legal body or tribunal, and to make an account to that body of the reasons for action, and to do so under legal jeopardy, right? In the sense that if the tribunal determines that the conditions of self-defense were not appropriately met, then that individual, of course, can be subject to criminal sanction. Now, if that's right, then that also has implications, obviously, for conditions for engaging in war and other forms of conflict, including in revolutionary conflict. So if you're a revisionist about the ethics of war, and we believe that there is an authority condition in the case of individual self-defense, then that authority condition will obviously read up and read across into the conditions of political action and warfare. So in other words, if we think that there's a requirement to defer to an authority for individuals in cases of individual self-defense, then that has to be also the case in the context of warfare. And I think, you know, what's interesting to think back about the institutional history of the way that the political community has dealt with problems of war and conflict over the last 60, 70 years is that the United Nations, and particularly the United Nations Security Council, can be read as an attempt to establish precisely that kind of independent, authoritative body for making judgments about the appropriateness of recourse to war and violence in the political domain. Now, of course, the Security Council is a highly flawed body, and it only very, very approximately captures those conditions of an authoritative decision-making entity that I outlined at the outset, that of having competence, both epistemic and deliberative, and secondly, the appropriate motivations to track underlying reasons. Nonetheless, I think that it's clearly an example of a move away from the traditional understanding of authority, essentially meaning conducted under the sovereign of the state, towards one that is more attempting to capture the reading of authority that I've given here today, that has to do with the capacities to deliberate in a particularly reliable and authoritative way. So I'll stop there.
David, if you would like to call on people, I will bring the microphone around. Looks like we have many people that are interested. Ian, you want to start?
A democratic process is being important to legitimate authority. And that doesn't strike me as a process that is necessarily impartial or responsive to reasons. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that when we elect officials, the process is actually designed to have us select people who represent our interests perhaps even more forcefully than we would ourselves. So do you think that that means that the democratic process shouldn't be part of the legitimate authority condition, or do you think there's something about the democratic process that makes it legitimate despite that feature?
So I think the democratic process is part of the legitimating conditions, but I think it's doing different work to the kind of authority condition that I'm talking about here. So very roughly, if you think about what needs to be justified in the decision to go to war, there are really, two big buckets that you can think about. So one is the bucket that involves the harm that you will inflict on the enemy and third-party states or individuals. And the other bucket has to do with the harm and the cost that will be inflicted on your own citizens and people. Now, the democratic process, I think, can tell us a lot about that second kind of required legitimation, right? Why should it be that the state is empowered or permitted to, require its citizens or impose on its citizens the sufferings and costs of war? Well, a big part of that has to be the fact that, the government has been empowered to do that through democratic process. I think it can tell us very, very little about the first kind of harm that needs to be justified, right? Why we should take it that they have a special capacity to determine whether outsiders are liable to the harm that they will inflict upon them in war. So I do think it plays a role. I just think it plays a different role.
Is this on? Yeah. So the thing about authorities is that the thing about authorities is that there are always multiple claimants to authority. So the one thing I'm wondering is, do you have to have a reliable mechanism for determining who the reliable authorities are? So, for example, suppose that I flip a coin. There's multiple claimants to authority, and I flip a coin, and I just so happen to land on the reliable authority. Have I satisfied your requirements, or do I need something more than that?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So the worry here is, if we need an authority to decide what the right thing is to do, then we need another authority to decide who is the authority to determine what's the right thing to do. And so we get an infinite regress of authorities, and that's clearly not going to be a good position to end up in. So I don't think it's quite as bad as that in a practical sense, because one of the things about what's clear is that primary judgment is required in both cases, right? Both in the cases of deciding, what we think the reasons permit or require us to do in a situation, and kind of who we think is, has the capabilities to make those decisions. But the two judgments are different in the very practical sense, that you can make the judgments about who fulfills the conditions of authority, as it were, ahead of time, in a calm, cool space, and you can make that under conditions of kind of prospectively thinking about the multitude of different scenarios and different agents who might make call of that authority, right? So already built into the way that we think about selecting authority is a much more reasons-responsive, authoritative approach. Compared, for example, with the kinds of determinations that need to be made around going to war, acting in self-defense, which are, almost by definition made in the heat of the moment, very compressed time frames, very significant emotions in the room. So I think there are reasons to think that our ability to determine, the identity and nature of those authoritative bodies are likely to be far preferable to our ability to determine the first order questions in situ. So I think that's at least one difference between them.
Thank you for the talk. I'm curious if you conceive of the authority condition as a principled requirement or as a recommended rule of thumb. So I've always thought of the historical instantiation of the authority requirement as being a principled requirement. And your proposal seems like a very plausible action guiding rule of thumb. I'm less convinced it's a principled requirement such that someone would necessarily act on it.
So the ambition is to get us much closer to the principled requirements, right? So there are all kinds of reasons that you could think it's a good thing to have some kind of authority playing this role. It can be broadly consequentialist reasons. There can be Lockean reasons. The problem with all of those is there are going to be situations where the reasons are going to play out in a different way. And so what I'm trying to give here is I'm trying to give an account of why we should think that when decision-making is burdened in certain kinds of ways, that is a wrong-making feature of the act. And that to recognize that requires us to take certain steps to mitigate that. And so, does it get us all the way to a principled reason? I don't know, but the ambition is to get us closer to that at least.
Alan, and then Stephen, and then you raise your hand. This is much more work than I thought it would be.
Okay, you run around. So look, I think, there absolutely could be multiple authorities on this account, but if the condition of being an authority is that the determinations are reliable with respect to underlying reasons, then we would expect the judgments of those multiple authorities to converge. And the fact that we're seeing convergence would be evidence that they are indeed genuine authorities. Divergence or failure of convergence would be evidence to the opposite. So I think that's part of the way that we deal with that. I think in terms of multiple or different underlying moral reasons, I think I'm less worried about. So you mentioned differing reasons and different perceptions of reasons. I think I'm less worried about the second than the first. I think if there are genuinely different obligations, different moral reasons that different individuals are subject to, then that's something that needs to come out in terms of the all things considered judgments that a properly situated authority would need to make. You're thinking about those different reasons in a...
Well, I guess it just sounds like, who has that knowledge, who has that moral expertise to be able to sort of sum together all of the different moral reasons applied to all of the relevant agents and then come up with some
So nobody is going to have that. So there's outside of God, there's never going to be a perfect moral authority. So what we're talking about here is is I think a sufficiency condition. So the first point is that there are clearly differences between better and worse entities at making those judgments. And authority condition, I think, in my view, is met when the capabilities are good enough. They're good enough to do the job, or that's again going to be situationally dependent, and it might it'll be responsive to conditions at a particular point in time. What is possible, and it may be that what is good enough is actually simply the best available.
So this is back to the individual case of the assailant, the black attacker. And the clarification is, so I agree that something is sort of off when the person coming to the defense would not have done so otherwise had the attacker not been black. But there is still sort of a responsiveness to the right reasons in those cases, right? Assuming that had the person only been black, that were the only reason, that the person would not have intervened, right? And so I wonder if you're allowing for those cases. And so if we sort of go to the international level too, that seems to be the right test too. It's okay, we might think, if a country would not have intervened had it not been for some bad reason. It's okay so long as they have these other right reasons that they're still responsive to. And so the first question is that sort of consistent with your view? And is that I don't see a problem with that, but I think that might be a nice way to sort of further explain it.
So I think I think it's implicit. It's implicit also in the Getty analogy that I gave, that responsiveness to the right reasons is not enough, right? So I look at the clock. That's the right kind of reason. I look at the clock. It says it's 2:30. That's the right kind of reason for believing that it's 2:30. It's just that if the conditions are so radically unreliable in the context that there's really, that there's no reliable connection between the judgment and the underlying facts, we're very reluctant to call that knowledge. And I think a comparable kind of thing is going on here. So it's. I think it's not sufficient that you're sensitive to the right kinds of reasons. I think it's also important that your judgments are reliably tracking those reasons. Again, not perfectly, but to a sufficient degree. And we can argue about what that is. So when I spell out the case in the paper more fully, I describe it actually in two ways. So I say, if the attacker had been white, he wouldn't have reached the conclusion that he was an unjust attacker. And if it had been a black aggressor in context where any reasonable observer would have determined that it wasn't an unjust attack, this individual still would have determined that it was an unjust attack. And that's a kind of reliability where it just feels like you want to say, look, he lucked out, he got the right judgment here. And yes, it was on the basis of the right reasons. So there's at least, there is that elementary responsiveness to the right reasons. But the process of determination is so radically unreliable that he oughtn't to get the benefit of that kind of justificatory underpinnings.
Thank you for the talk. So two quick questions. I also heard you making a Rodin-style argument for maybe to come back more favorably than Alan. So my first question is the idea of self-defense as a post hoc justification for the action. And one way to understand that in Rodin terms is that the person who committed the act of violence or in self-defense, all they have to establish is that they weren't more likely to get it right by following the rule and by acting on their own judgment. They don't actually have to get it right. So I'm wondering whether in your analysis of revolutionary wars and having all the post hoc justification, whether you'd say what you have to show is you got it right, or whether you only have to show that you weren't more likely to get it right by following the rule. So that's one question. Second question is, but this might have also revisionist implications, or kind of more familiar examples of returning authority. So I've argued that General Dallaire had no duty to defer to his superior's judgment that he ought not to use force to prevent Hutu groups from committing the atrocities that made up the Rwandan genocide, precisely because he had very good reasons to think that their judgment was not truth-tracking, and that his judgment was more likely to track the truth than that. So
Yeah, no, good. So that's a kind of that's a kind of inverse of the argument, starting from the same premises, but a kind of an inverse argument. So so I like that. So look, I think one of the implications of this line of thought, if you do find it persuasive, is that we might view the establishment of some kind of ex ante authorizing body like the Security Council, or Security Council Plus, that's actually functions like a like a proper authority. And in addition, some kind of post facto review is actually one of the significant conditions for viewing acts of war, revolution, violence as being justified at all. That somehow, that those features are not kind of extraneous add-ons, but they're actually partially constitutive of how we understand the rightful action itself. And to me, that's a fruitful way of thinking about it. And these kinds of cases kind of, I think, to suggest that. And provide a nice, normative impetus towards those kinds of quite practical developments, institutional developments.
Yes, thank you, David. I wanted to push you a little bit more on how this plays out in insurgency or revolutionary warfare. Because from some of the questions, I get the impression that we're still not clear about how to satisfy the authority requirement. It seems like one criterion is going to be capability. Another one is going to be some invested right to make a decision, either because the body is democratic in some way or there's some kind of tribal or patrimonial authority you can build on. But one of the questions got me thinking about some sort of, I'll call it coordinated or aggregate authority, thinking about how social media works. So it used to be in the day, if I wanted a hotel, I would go to the government website and I'd pick it that way. Now I depend on the aggregate of what people say on TripAdvisor. So if you look at some of the colored revolutions that were kind of grew up from below based on the expansion of social media and more people joining in, not because it was a leader there as there would be in an ordinary social movement, because of more and more people. The question is, does that serve as an authority? And my second question is what do we do with the authority? So now you have a group, non-state group, that satisfies the authority requirement. Then what? Are they now recognized belligerents? Do they now achieve the status of those who have
Yeah.
war rights of some sort? Where do you go with it once you
Yeah.
give them authority?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the last point, I think all that you conclude is that they satisfy, they satisfy that requirement of just of your sed bellum. That we've, I mean, the ambition is to try and suggest an interpretation of that your sed bellum condition that I think is meaningful, that is applicable to intrastate revolutionary conflicts, and that that's a meaningful way of understanding that as a substantive constraint. So the only thing you could read off satisfaction is that they've satisfied that condition. Whether they've satisfied any of the others at all or not is still an open question. So I think the kind of disaggregated social media thing is really interesting. I don't think there's any reason to object to that. If the underlying account that I've given, which is that there is a reliable connection, that the determinations, the judgments reliably track underlying reasons. I think we can probably be agnostic about the route to which we get that. So the account that I gave, is a very traditional procedural account, very familiar from tribunals, law courts, and so forth. But you might think about a move which is comparable to the difference between, the way that traditional scientific inquiry would determine whether there's a causal connection between, or there's, between two different phenomena, which has to do with, building a theory, testing that theory, building confidence in it. So there's between that on the one hand and the way that a lot of, big data algorithms work, where there's just, there's no theory at all. It's just simply, very, very large significant correlations that turn out to be reliable indicators. Nobody really knows why or how. We just see that they're reliable, and it may well be that that's that's good enough. It's just that there are multiple routes to getting to the same destination.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to hear you just saying that you're thinking of a primarily procedural device, because I'm trying to figure out what kind of an international or impartial body might be in a good position to make an epistemic judgment about the validity, the justifiability of a revolution. And it seems to me that the Security Council is not even, it doesn't even conceive of itself that way. It's according to the UN Charter, it's empowered to make findings about international aggression, which revolutions just don't fall into that basket, and threats to international peace and security, which if a revolution, unless it's spilling over, that's not part of its remit either. And even if it were, I don't think that the Security Council can make up its mind whether it's an epistemic body, fact-finding, or making authoritative judgments of the kind you're asking, or a political body that is representing the interests of the parties that are on the Security Council. So that if you picked up the hood of the Security Council, you might find that it's a broken clock rather than a working clock. But I guess the question that I want to ask is, what question, this is a follow-up on Michael's, what question are you asking, whatever the international body is, to answer about revolutions? And what kind of international body could we imagine that could answer, that could be in a position to answer that question?
So I don't have particularly very much to offer on the second question. I think you're clearly right about the Security Council. I think it's it's really the vaguest approximation of the kind of entity that I'm describing.
Well, it's like the clock. It doesn't get things wrong all the time.
No,
but
no,
it
that's
doesn't.
right. No, but that's, as you say, it's like the broken clock, right? The broken clock tells the right time twice a day. But that's not, that's not what we require of an authoritative timekeeper. So that, that's clearly right about the Security Council. Now the ICC, now that crime of aggression is justiciable under the ICC, may be a better approximation of the kind of thing that I'm
For aggression, but not
for,
for
no,
revolution.
no, that's right.
Not
That's
for
right. So,
revolution.
and you know, so look, so the short answer is that I don't know. You know, nothing extant in the political institutional realm at the moment. So yeah, so that you may find that not a particularly helpful answer beyond an invitation to think about what kinds of institutional reforms and development might be able to fill that role at some point, but I don't think I have anything particularly useful to say about that.
Okay, but how about the other question? What question would you want the body to answer about revolutions?
I think the question is, was the revolution consistent? Was it permissible given underlying norms of permissible action for revolutionary, non-state violence? And there are clearly, again, competing interpretations of that. For a revisionist, it's going to be a very different set of underlying questions than it will be for a. But the underlying question is to make reliable determinations of whether those agents had acted in conformity with underlying norms.
I wonder whether, I know as a revisionist, to the extent you're a revisionist, you don't believe in moral equality of combatants, but as a practical matter, accept the legal equality of combatants, right? So I wonder whether the determination then would simply be, unless that the determination would be that the insurgent forces are the ones who are acting justly, and the regime is acting unjustly. But if you're still willing to accept nonetheless that legal equality of combatants, whether an appropriate determination might be simply whether there exists an armed conflict between the two that would trigger in bello rules. So this is similar to what what happened in Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions when they added to parties who are combatants in an international armed conflict, Michael described this morning, certain non-state groups that were acting against colonial forces, racist regimes, and so forth.
Yeah.
So perhaps a more modest kind of determination. That is something as to which there are criteria, which people, there's controversy, but at least there's a sort of a wide precedent.
So I know that was meant as a friendly suggestion, but unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to avail of myself of it because I'm one of those I'm one of those people who thinks that the legal equality is also very, very problematic. So clearly, as a matter of existing law, there is legal equality, but I think that that's actually very, very problematic from an ethical perspective. So yes, I appreciate the friendly comment, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to avail myself very much from
to
it.
discuss that issue.
Yeah.
All right, well, David, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to say that you gave a talk on analytical philosophy after lunch, which generated a huge number of questions. So that's what I call a gifted philosopher.
And I didn't see cell phones, which I'm
So we want to present to you a token of our appreciation, which is a cap, which we here in the States would call a baseball cap, but you can use it for cricket as well.
As long as it doesn't say Make America Great on it.
No, it does not. But thank you so much. We appreciate it.